Back with us is Priya Sridhar outside the Carter Center in Atlanta. Jonathan Alter also with us this morning, former Democratic Congresswoman Jane Harman, who worked in the Carter administration as the chair currently of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy. And Priya, as we're watching these images, we saw just a brief glimpse of people, and there have been more than 20,000 people that have filed past the former president's casket in these last couple of hours and days.
Yeah, that's right, Jose. And, you know, I got a chance to sit down with the former president's grandson, Jason Carter, who also gave some emotional remarks at the private funeral service that was held here at the Carter Center on Saturday. And he said that he was just absolutely blown away with the outpouring of support that he's really felt from people around the world, but especially here in their home state of Georgia. He said that he was so emotional riding in that motorcade from Plains here to Atlanta, and he's had an opportunity to listen to some of the mourners. I got a chance to go inside the Carter Center and see the former president lying in repose, and I even got a chance to read some of the comments that people have been leaving in the guest books. And it's really just this sense of pride that someone who came from rural Georgia, that came from a farm where there was no electricity or running water, could make it all the way to the White House. And really what I've been hearing from so many of the people who wanted to come out here and pay their respects is that it was the type of man that he was, the way that he carried himself, his moral compass, his resiliency, even that sort of underdog story, the fact that he was relatively unknown outside of the state of Georgia before he made his way to the White House. And when he came back here to Georgia, he didn't give up on his dedication to service. He started the Carter Center and really launched into this humanitarian work that spanned over 4 decades. And so Jason Carter was just telling me that, you know, he feels all the love and the support of the people who have been coming out here. And of course, we're going to just continue to see that as the former president makes his final journey to Washington, D.C.
I'm just thinking, Jonathan, you that have studied so much Jimmy Carter, his legacy, his work. You know, Priya was, you know, when she talks about 4 decades of service after the White House, he was only in the White House for 4 years. What stands out to you, Jonathan, as being maybe the basic pillars of that legacy of service?
Well, I think that he was a flawed politician, but a visionary American leader. So I first got interested in writing a book about him when I learned that he was talking about global warming in the 1970s, before anybody anywhere in the world in any kind of leadership position was doing so. And he, if he'd been reelected, he wanted electric cars by the mid-1980s. He was basically 30 years ahead of his time on that issue, but achieved a lot on the environment and on other issues. So what really surprised me was that I had, and I think a lot of other people had, sort of underestimated his achievements while in office. They were overshadowed by the fact that he was shellacked by Ronald Reagan in 1980. So he was a political failure, but a very successful leader, if you look at the actual legislative record. And then he was the only, you know, president who used the presidency, as the former president of Emory University said, as a stepping stone to a whole nother career of service, in which he revolutionized and redefined the role of a former president in our country. And the achievements after he left office are not as great as those when he was in office, because former presidents don't have any actual power. But he set an example for the world, and an example for people in all walks of life to try to do more to help other people. And whether it was eradicating diseases or promoting democracy, standing up for human rights, making peace, he and Rosalind Carter touched, changed, and in some cases saved the lives of millions of people around the world. It's hard to think of,
Jonathan,
legacy beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah, Jonathan, I mean, I was just thinking, just in my personal 40 years as a journalist, I remember being in Nicaragua in 1990, in those February 1990 elections, when, Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, surprise win over Daniel Ortega. Carter was there, leading a delegation of 34 people. But there also, Jonathan, were, as you say, achievements while in the White House, but a lot of, there's in every person's life, there is light and there is shadow, and there were certainly political shadows throughout those 4 years. And I'm thinking of, Carter's involvement with Iran, the Iranian Revolution. Let's not forget the Mariel boat lift and why the Mariel boat lift happened. Let's not forget his positions on Taiwan, that he broke relations essentially with Taiwan. I mean, there were a lot of issues, Jonathan, that he actually took a proactive leadership role in that ended up having broad repercussions that we feel even today.
Yeah, I want to just focus, Jose, if I can, for a moment on Nicaragua in 1990. This is one of his lesser-known achievements, but Violeta Chamorro won that election against Daniel Ortega. And Daniel Ortega was saying that he would not leave office. And Jimmy Carter, who was down monitoring the election, stayed up with him all night and said, look, it's hard to lose. I know I lost. It's hard to lose. But for the sake of your people, you must leave office. And he talked Ortega into doing it. Now, of course, Ortega's back. But he left office. And I interviewed, in addition to many interviews with Jimmy Carter, I interviewed the late President George H.W. Bush. And he told me how grateful he was to Jimmy Carter for getting Ortega out. So on many of these issues, even when he suffered setbacks, there were major achievements connected to them, not just Camp David and the Panama Canal, but many other major achievements that lend a new perspective to some of his shortcomings.
I remember that long night very well in Managua in 1990, as where all of us were wondering what was Ortega going to do. And Jane, just thinking of now, Jimmy Carter's body is being transferred to Washington, D.C., where there will be a whole slew of ceremonies in honoring the former president. I know that you had the opportunity to do what few are able to do, which is have personal moments and relationship with a president. Jimmy Carter, what are some of the things that you stay close to with those moments with then President Jimmy Carter?
Well, I worked in his White House. I was the deputy cabinet secretary, a job I moved to after spending 5 years as counsel to a U.S. Senate subcommittee. And I was there at the beginning. I saw little Amy, his daughter, running around the White House. I met Miss Lillian, his mother. And I saw him learn how to be president. He did bring what's called the Georgia Mafia with him. I think he might have made some better choices if he picked people with more experience in Washington. But nonetheless, he did that. And he did many things. Let me push gently back against Jonathan that I think are signature achievements, especially elevating human rights to a plank of U.S. foreign policy. You played a quote earlier, Jose, that said, from him, that said, America did not invent human rights. It is in a very real sense, human rights invented America. And I think that's true. And his moral clarity, his humility were unique and still are unique in the presidencies that have followed him. So I saw that the Camp David Accords was obviously, I think we can all agree, a huge achievement to his tenacity. I mean, he wouldn't let the two leaders leave Camp David without an agreement. He made mistakes too, I agree. It wasn't his fault that our hostages were seized. He played that badly. He said that in hindsight. But also, Iran didn't release them until Reagan was sworn in as president. Pretty cruel act in terms of respect for Carter, who made such an effort to get them out. So since his presidency, I think we all agree, too, 4 decades is an amazing achievement. And I think the things he did, including the election observation missions. I was in Egypt and saw the Carters in that one. I also visited them in planes. My late husband, Sidney Harmon, and I met in the White House. And Sidney served on the Carter Center board for a period, and we stayed in touch with the Carters. And one final memory, if I could, which is that when I decided to run for Congress in 1991, which is the first elected office I had sought since junior high school president, which I lost, Carter sent me a $500 check with a note that said, when you are elected, you will represent not only California, but the Carter family. Beat that. That was just an amazing personal experience with an amazing man.